In a world where Africans have lost their roots, it has become of vital importance to document our ways. In an effort to reverse the brainwashing of the past, where we were made to believe our ways are demonic, we are pressed to create dignified and respectful platforms to unpack our spiritual ways. Moya light, Moya bright. Welcome to another episode of Moya Political Series. As you know, guys, we like to educate you. This is the school, and the school work you're not going to get at the white schools. As usual, I have an elder who's here to teach us a bit about economics and what's happening with, all this big jargon that we're faced with that Duma Gqubule, who is a political journalist and an economist. I know that these conversations sometimes fly over our heads, so we try to bring in elders to come and kind of unpack. Molo Tata, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Nice to meet you eventually. And I remember I was at one of my columns at Business Day. You had said something that is very controversial, which I can't remember what it was. And I felt like I had to defend you,
Oh, really?
So I wrote a column about you as to Ntsiki Mazwai was correct,
Thank you.
I can't remember what it was about, but yeah.
It's not the one about living in a society of, what's the word for people who suck up?
No. I think it was about President Ramaphosa. I can't. Yeah, you said
yes,
something
it was.
Okay. Yes. So I think I can't remember what it was. Yeah.
But Kamaku, thank you so much. It's not easy being to give us.
Okay.
But thank you so much for coming through and honoring the invitation. Mm-hmm. As I've already said to the youth, we brought you here so that you can kind of unpack. There's this thing called GNU happening. There's the issue of the economy. There's the issue of DA essentially owning the economy, which is how we got to GNU. So if we can unpack that for us.
Now I don't know where to start. There's different ways of slicing it. Ntsiki, you can start at the beginning, 1994, or you can start at the beginning of the Ramaphosa presidency. I hope we can slice it in different ways, but let's start at the beginning. If whichever way you slice the data, the ANC rule has been deeply disappointing. I call it, they were talking about the 9 wasted years under Zuma. And then I looked at the economics data and I discovered that the 6 years under Ramaphosa were actually worse than the 9 wasted years under Zuma. So I just look at the numbers. I'm not interested in the politics, Then someone, I think on social media, actually pointed out to me that no, it's not 9 wasted years or 6 wasted years. It's actually 30 wasted years under ANC rule. So I looked at the numbers again. Then I saw, yes, it was 30 wasted years under ANC rule. So we've got this thing called GDP per capita. It's an imperfect measure of average living standards. GDP is the amount of goods and services we produce in the economy, and then you divide it by the number of people in the economy. So GDP per capita, since 1994, average living standards is about 22% increase. Now, if you compare it with China, 783%. India, I think, is about 285%. Vietnam, 337%. Rwanda, 335%. Ethiopia is about 315%, And so I'm just saying that other countries in this period have done so much better than we have. So the politicians like to blame global forces, but if you look at other countries that are similar to us, they have performed far better than us. So then if you slice it again from 1994 to 2008, let's do it per presidency. So under Madiba, it was 2.7% growth. Our economy was growing about 2.7% a year. Under Thabo Mbeki, it was about 4% a year. And then under Zuma, it was about 1.9%. Under Ramaphosa, 0.5% a year over the past 6 years, And I'll come back to that, And then there's another way of slicing it. You can see it as a story of two halves. From 1994 to 2008, this is the first 15 years of our democracy, we grew by about 3.6% a year. It was not spectacular. It was solid, but not great. But I think many South Africans felt that they're getting a little bit better, but we could do so much better. That's what happened here. And then what happened over the last 15 years, we have had literally a collapse in the trend GDP growth rate to 1.2% a year. So what you see is that in 2023, and you compare with 2007, we have had declining average living standards, GDP per capita, for 16 years straight. And the forecast is for, and we will talk about this. People are talking about this government, what I call the right-wing coalition between the ANC and the DA, or as one professor calls it, the government of neoliberal unity. Under this right-wing government, this right-wing coalition, because that's what it is, or the government of neoliberal unity, it's going to continue. The forecast is for another 3 years until 2026, according to the government's own forecast and of the IMF and the World Bank. So by the end of 2026, we will have had 19 years of declining average living standards. You saw what happened in Kenya. At some point, something has to break in this country. So the situation right now is that we have, in 2023 data, we have the world's highest unemployment rate. I think number two was Djibouti on the Horn of Africa. And number 3, this was before the genocide, was the West Bank and Gaza. Now that gives you an idea of the scale of this unemployment crisis. We've got 12.1 million people who do not work. The unemployment rate is 41.9%. For African women, I get stats that say to give me the figures. I think it's about 51%. African women, 51% unemployed. That is a situation that can't continue in this country. So then the final way is to slice it according to economic policies that the government did. So there was this policy called GEAR that came in 1996, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then after GEAR ended, we started creating jobs, as economic policy should tell you. And then since the 2009, the global financial crisis, we saw a collapse in the economy. So that collapse during the last 15 years coincides with the collapse of the ANC's electoral support, which we can talk about later. So under 1996, there was this propaganda that, that we had an apartheid debt crisis. So the ANC was persuaded by financial markets, that we have a debt crisis that we have to address too. And I looked at the data many times, and I look at it, it was 50% of GDP. That is not high by any standards, and I was editing a book on BEE, 10 years later and looking into this. And Moya, who was the publisher of the book, he says, well, Duma, just explain, if there was no debt crisis, why did the first thing they do is just to cut spending and increase interest rates, to suffocate the economy? And what would you say? I said, well, Moya, I read your brother's paper called State and Transformation, and the charitable thing you can say is that they didn't know what they were doing. Yes, so I'm not sure whether we can still say so, but that's what I said to Moya at the time. So during the GEAR period, so roughly when Ntsiki, people must understand a national budget does not operate like your household budget. So there's a study that was done in the UK and the US, but it was done by a South African-born economist called Anne Pettifor and a colleague of hers. She went to Wits University and she's now an activist on global debt issues in the third world. And she's one of the economists I follow, and she's a development economist. Anyway, she looked at the UK and the US over the past century. So when the government spends into the economy grows and the debt goes down. Mm-hmm. So that's not what happens in your household. Now, it's a very, very difficult to explain it to someone who equates it with So they looked at data throughout the whole of the 20th century until the beginning of the 21st century. And after so now in South Africa, our trend follows exactly the same. Although spending is not the only important thing in the economy, it roughly follows the government macroeconomic policy stance. So during this gear period, government consumption spending went up by about 2.1% a year.
Okay.
And then government investment, which is a big importance in terms of creating jobs, it collapsed by 25% from 1998 to 2001 and only went back to 2001 levels by 2004. So we had what I call the first public sector investment strike. So guess what happens? The economy grows about 2.9% a year and unemployment soars from 33% to 40.3% in the first quarter of 2003. 40.6%. The number of unemployed people goes from 4.6 million people to 8 million people the first quarter of 2003. So whichever way you look at it, this gear policy is a disaster. So
why would there be economic growth and less employment?
Well, there wasn't enough economic. So now this is another issue that we should explain, is that there has never been jobless growth in South Africa. So I've cut and sliced the data everywhere over the past 30 years. So when the economy grows by 1 percentage point and 1%, employment grows by 0.9. So all that has happened, Ntsiki, over the past 30 years is that our economy hasn't grown fast enough to cater for the annual new entrants into the labor force and the people who were previously unemployed. So we might have been creating jobs, but they were too little to be able to counter the rising tide of people who are entering the labor force. And we might come back to that later if there's time. So the number of unemployed, so we were growing, but the number of jobs that we were creating was not enough to get through the tide. So then the second period is that I like talking about this. So when we talk about this gear period, when I say the economy grew 4% under Thabo Mbeki, I'm implying that everything was great, but it wasn't necessarily. So the second period from 2003 to 2008, the economy grew by 4.5% a year. But if we start there, government started spending again. Consumption spending went up by 5% a year, and investment spending went up by 14% a year. And, people on the left, my colleagues on the left, they say there was a global financial crisis, the global commodity boom. But in a previous life, I was the go-to person on mining-related issues. And I can assure you that what happened there had very little to do with the global boom. We were one of the few countries that didn't benefit from it, but I won't really go into that, But we created 3.1 million jobs. Every sector of the economy created jobs. And the only sector that didn't create jobs was mining. It shed 110,000 jobs, So there was no boom. There was a boom in global commodity markets, but South Africa didn't benefit from it as it should have. And many studies were done at the time to show that that was the case. So the government started spending after the end of gear on consumption. When you spend on your people and your infrastructure, the economy grows, And then so what has happened over the last 15 years is that the government stopped spending. So consumption spending, 1.2% a year, which is lower than under gear, and investment has collapsed by 25% over this period. That is why our cities are crumbling everywhere. 25% collapse. Now, this is both metrics. It is worse than what was happening under gear, and the economy has collapsed. Now, this coincides with the collapse of the ANC's electoral support. So the unemployment rate increased to, so remember in the first period, it came down to 28.7%. And then now it's gone back to 41.9%. So what has happened during this period? The new entrants into the labor force increased by about 8.1 million over these years. But we created 2 million jobs. So the number of unemployed people went up from 5.9 million to 12.1 million. So that is the maths of the unemployment crisis. So that is the situation that we find ourselves in. And I say, so now this coincided with the collapse of ANC's electoral support. Now, it was 65.9% in Polokwane in 2009, and it went down to 62.15 in 2014 under Zuma. Now, under this presidency, Ramaphosa was supposed to be the person who, white people like him, we're going to have investment, we had something called the New Dawn, and it was supposed to result in an improved economic performance. And many people bought into that, But I obviously, I worked for the president in a previous life, but I knew, and he's actually, what people can't understand is that he's one of the nicest people you'll ever meet. But you can be the nice person, but be very bad performer. You know what I'm trying to say. So the people, I think the ordinary person can't, he looks like, I went to one of these book launches, the Xhosa elite, the Hyde Park, I won't mention names, So those people, they believe that, the only thing that went wrong, my sister corrected me, she says, no, it was the Mthatha elite. But anyway, so the only thing that went wrong is that there were a few bad apples in the ANC. And if we have good apples, middle-class people like you and me, all the problems are going to be solved. But they don't answer like, Ramaphosa is one of us, but things have collapsed, So the ANC, under this presidency, from 2014, so the first thing, so his 3 elections, So the first one was 2019. It went down and he was popular. This poll showed he's more popular than the ANC. He's popular amongst white people, and there's going to be investment. He's popular amongst the population, and he's more popular than the ANC. So it's a combination that's supposed to work. But as you saw, the economy collapsed and the ANC support collapsed. So now what happens under this? The first election, 2019, it declines by 4.65 percentage points to 57.5. And then there's a local government election. It comes down by 8.36 percentage points to around 46%. And then there's this election, it comes down by 17.32 percentage points. Now, if you compare from Zuma to now, that is 22 percentage points by this popular president. Now, where in the world, Ntsiki, could you have someone who's, let's just put aside the economy for a side, whose electoral performance is so bad, and there isn't even a discussion within the party as to why are we continuing on this? And what people say under this is that, okay, we agree with you, but who else? But anyway, that's the issue.
It's so interesting what you're saying, because essentially what I just heard you say was that the black elites think that their proximity to Abelung and Islum means that they know better.
Yes.
And as a result, that's why now it's showing that actually the quality of the leader actually does matter. And then you're also saying that these polls that were created for Ramaphosa, for some, it looked very PR generated. A lot like, I don't know if you remember when Freedom came with that Huntless Warriors campaign with the doves, bring peace in our land.
Yeah, vaguely, I can't remember. Yeah.
Well, when we came into the democracy, remember the bring peace in our land?
Not much, but I remember going to Hunt Lascaris' office, and I think I interviewed John Hunt and Reg Lascaris.
So this was actually a campaign from an agency that brought this freedom to South Africa. And I'm just busy trying to draw parallels between that time of Madiba Magic and Bring Peace South Africa.
It's a perfect analogy, because there was the Madiba Magic. It lasted for actually the Madiba one lasted quite a long time. So let's just say from an economic point of view, it lasted for about 2 years. So I like the analogy, it really works for me. So the currency strengthened during that period. It was strong, about 3.6. The currency strengthened about 3.6 against the dollar, and it was strong, it stayed there. And I remember interviewing the Reserve Bank governor and Chris Stiles, and I said, my first job, meeting Dr. Stiles, this is 2 years, the currency has been so strong. Surely it can't continue like this. It's not, but they had been there. So the Madiba Magic did last for about 2 years. But guess what? It all collapsed with this gear policy. And there was also a market collapse because there was something about his health. The markets thought that, Madiba went to hospital, and then there was a collapse.
In the market.
Yeah, then the markets collapsed, and then the ANC, the government, because of what I thought was what I would call a correction of an overvalued market, they panicked and they introduced this gear policy. And then fast forward, as you correctly say, to the new dawn. I did the numbers for the new dawn. So the currency started appreciating in November before the ANC conference in December. And it continued until about May. And then people realized colectively. So in the markets, the market people. So this one lasted maybe 6 months. So the Madiba one lasted 2 months, and then the New Dawn lasted about 6 months, and then everyone. So now we have the government of neoliberal unity. It is the same vibes, and as Caesar Mpofu-Walsh was saying, this GNU euphoria, this government of neoliberal euphoria, it's brought to you by the same people who brought you the New Dawn. Shouldn't you, or the Madiba Magic, or the Rainbow Nation, shouldn't you start wondering? And there was something, you remember in those days, the 90s,
Yes.
We were talking about the Rachel Ascaris. There's also the RDP, and a friend of mine said to me, he says, Duma, there's so many white people who are buying into this RDP. I'm beginning to get worried. Must be something wrong about it. Yeah. But I'm just saying, so now what we're seeing now is that, now what this period coincides with, is that in the US, in the economy, the inflation number recently came to about 3%, much lower than. So what drives these markets internationally is not really local noise. It's 90% of the time, it's global matters in terms of the financial markets. And what people need to understand, because these financial markets are scaring us not to implement, some people believe that other policies. So when this friend of mine, I said, no, but why do we have to go with the DA? Why couldn't you, ANC, have gone with, EFF, whatever, And then they say, no, there will be capital flight, So the threat, it's a lame threat of capital flight, is used to support this government, So I don't know what to say. So this one I've predicted it will fade as well. So I was saying that there's an inflation rate of 3% in the US. So everybody is betting that US interest rates will go down, and that's going to affect the dollar, which will go weaker, and the rand will strengthen for a while. So it's got nothing to do with South Africa, but the people are going, and the markets are going to do better, and people are going to say, yeah, this thing's working, And then number two, what people should remember is that the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, 80% of the assets on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange have got nothing to do with South African economy. I'll give you an example, is that BHP Billiton, it's number one, the largest company on the JSE. It's an Australian iron ore company. They tried to buy Anglo recently. So they do iron ore and copper and whatever globally. They account for 20% of the JSE. And they don't have a single South African mine. So when the market goes up on the JSE, I have to remind people that 80% of this JSE has got nothing to do with South Africa. And then a big portion has got to do with the Chinese company called Tencent, which you've got National Pers and companies, South African companies that are linked to that company. So very little of it has got to do with South Africa. So yeah, this euphoria, it's gonna disappear as quickly as the New Dawn and the Madiba Magic disappeared. I believe, yeah. And actually, I'm very depressed when Ntsiki. I was telling a friend that, I'm going to detox from politics, no public appearances, because I know that this is a disaster. I was talking to her yesterday, and she says, oh, but I'm going to Ntsiki's show, and I said, I felt like I couldn't let down Ntsiki and the Mazwai family. I know Tammy very well. So I've just felt like I had to come here as well. Yeah.
When you speak about capital flight and the people, especially the black people defending capital flight.
Yeah. It's used as a threat.
I'm trying to understand, how does it impact them on the ground? Because I'm finding that Abantu Abamnyama are defending these markets, but our standards of living are not improving. And as you say, the economy of the JSE doesn't improve.
Yeah, so I don't know. Okay, the capital flight. So in terms of the capital flight, I was supposed to be writing, I was so busy, and Paramila she asked me to, let us unpack this thing in an article. So, but anyway, so number one, you must remember that the shares on the JSE have got nothing to do with the South African economy. Yeah, most of them. Number two, when the rand is going up and down, it's seldom got anything to do with South African economy. Like when Ntsiki was fired in 2015 December, it coincided with the first increase in interest rates in the US for 7 years. So it was the start of a cycle. I believe it had nothing to do with South African economy. Do you see what I'm saying? Because I looked at the data at the time, and this thing had disappeared, the so-called collapse of the, so I believe it was mostly reacting to that, but I let it lie, So number two is that the rand has got nothing to do with South Africa. The third issue I want to say is that we have a central bank, a reserve bank. So when there's capital flight, there's the number of options. Number one, you can do nothing. Now, doing nothing is actually an option that should be considered because we're a resource-rich economy.
Yeah.
A weak currency. There's many case studies in economics of countries that have boomed on the back of a weaker currency. Now, if you look at China, they manipulated their currency downwards. At the beginning, that was their model to export, yeah. And most of the East Asian countries, the yen is about 200, it's a weak currency. It was used to stimulate exports. So under certain circumstances, just doing nothing and communicating to the market that we don't care, you can punish our currency, and that's fine. That's an option. Number two, the Reserve Bank can interfere. So I just have to mention, like the Russian, one of the biggest capital flights in the world was Russia in 1998. They defaulted on their debt, and the currency, went through meltdown. Worse than under Ukraine, it went down by about 300%. And that was the start of the Russian boom that lasted for about 8 years of the first Putin presidency. It was a huge boom. That was the biggest boom in a century in Russia. So I'm just saying, a currency that collapses doesn't have to be a disaster for a developing country. That's number one. As long as, so number two, the central bank can intervene. Now, do you know that during COVID, there was the largest outflow of capital from emerging markets globally and in South Africa? Now, the cost of government debt went up by about 300 basis points. Mm-hmm. And guess what happened? The central bank, the Reserve Bank, started buying these government bonds that people were selling on the market to restore order and calm in the market. They didn't spend that much, but the mere signal, they spent about 40 billion rand. The mere signal that we're going to step into this market and we're going to create order, it calmed everything down. And most South Africans do not remember that there was this huge capital outflow of in excess of 100 billion rands in the wake of COVID. Nobody remembers that. Because the Reserve Bank intervened in the thing. So that is the second thing we can do. We can also intervene in the market. And then the third way, you can introduce capital controls. Now, the most famous example of capital controls happened in the wake of the Asian crisis in the late 90s, when the president of Malaysia, Mahathir Mohamad, he wrote a foreword to my book that I edited back in the day. So what happened then is that he introduced capital flows. So it's you introduce mechanisms to prevent people from taking their money out and causing instability in your country. So what I say, I'm part of a school called Modern Monetary Theory. I'm a big believer, is that you have to, as a country, reduce your dependence. You have to create monetary sovereignty and reduce your dependence on these capital flows, the destabilizing capital flows. And the first thing you must do, this JSE that is distorted by these large inward listings, we should ban them so that the money isn't coming in and out of South Africa and causing instability to buy these shares of BHP, whatever, that have got nothing to do with South Africa. So that's number one. Number two, so we can do certain things to, number two, we have to reduce. So we've got about government own a good thing that's happened in South Africa in the recent years. The second thing about capital outflows, the government bond market, where the government sells their debt. It's about 4.5 trillion rand market. So what has happened there is that there's been a decline in government, in foreign ownership of that market from 41% to 25%. So that is a good thing. And guess what? Nobody even knows about that in South Africa, because local banks bought these bonds from the exiting people. So all these threats, I can take you throughout history of South African economy. There is something that we can do to counter this threat of capital flight. And we must reduce the ownership of these government bonds to less than 10%, the foreign ownership, reduce the foreign ownership of shares on the JSE to less than 10%. I would ban these large dual listings. I would completely ban them, and they must move out of South Africa and list elsewhere, because all they're doing is causing instability in our market. So we can do a lot as a country, and we have to reduce this, because if you look at like Kenya's got high foreign currency debt. Every emerging market currency problem is because of this foreign currency debt, because when the currency is, what you owe is in your own currency, then it shouldn't be a problem. Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah. So Ntsiki, I think we should be talking about as well, how do we get out of the situation? But before we go there, now there's this current situation with the right-wing coalition. I do the numbers, and it looks terrible for our country. I project for the next 5 years so the numbers on unemployment, the labor force is going to grow by 700,000 a year, and we will create just under 200,000 jobs. The number of unemployed people is going to increase by about it's going to increase to about 14 million. I can't remember. I did the numbers before I came here, sorry. But the point is, we're going to see continuing rising unemployment by about 500,000 every year for the term of this government of neoliberal unity. So by the end of the 5th year, my forecasts are always right, by the way, is that we're going to have increase in unemployment from 12.1 million people, and then you add 2.5, it's about 14.6 million people. Yeah. So that is the calamity that we're having. Because if you're the ANC, you've had, Mbalula calls it a calamity. It's a political earthquake. And you want to continue with the same economic policies that have failed dismally for 30 years, because what you're doing with this right-wing alliance, and people say there was no option, and that is not true. So let's just talk about this DA. So it's a coalition, because the two parties, the ANC and the DA, they count for 87.5% of this coalition. So the other parties are just irrelevant traffic. Do you see what I'm saying? So the ANC says, no, we invited everybody else, but you must tell the truth, in the sense that a precondition to those people, like when they went to the EFF, the precondition was that the DA will also be here. Now, if you have the EFF joining that arrangement, then the ANC and the DA is now 77%. You are irrelevant. So the DA has effectively got a veto over the ANC economic policy. The DA is an extreme right-wing party, and that has moved further to the right than when I last went to, talk at DA events. Like before the pandemic, I've been to a couple of DA events, and it was a different party than what it's become under John and Helen. You know what I'm saying? I remember going to one in the Southern Cape, and I was quite amazed, because there was some guy from Liberty Life, he talked, and I just got angry, and I just had a meltdown with him. I was one of the keynote speakers. It was an investment conference for the Eden municipality, and there were like 8 DA mayors in that place. And I got such a positive response. I had to ask my host, what is going on here? He says, no, most of these people were from the ANC and they defected to the DA. But what I'm trying to say, and these are mostly black mayors, do you see what I'm saying, on the DA. But now the DA has become white again, and let's not be shameless. So what I'm trying to say is that they've got the ANC and the DA in this right-wing coalition, they've got a mutual, as Season Pofu Walsh says, a mutual veto on each other. And it's only thing that it's going to do is to lock in, it's an airtight lock on these failed economic policies here. Yeah.
You keep going back to this unemployment thing, and a lot of industries and a lot of entrepreneurs always complain that there's a lot of barriers to entry into especially the more lucrative industries. And it sounded like when you said the economy is growing slowly but not getting enough jobs, it sounds like the solution to that would be to invest in entrepreneurs and small businesses and growing people that can create the jobs, but we're not seeing that. So,
okay, there's two issues. There's a demand issue, there's a structural issue. Like I think when people talk structural, they use it I don't like the way the word is used, like when they say it's a structural issue. But the structural issue is, like, if you look at like the world unemployment rate, it's about 5%. In South Africa, it's 42%. It's shocking, yeah. It's incredible, yeah. And then if you look at other developing countries, so the difference between, let's say, other African countries is that people are employed, but the quality of the work is not great. So, I grew up in Swaziland. People lived off the land. There was, they lived off the land. Maybe I'm romanticizing my childhood in Eswatini, but the people who are living off the land, I remember there's a lot of fruits and malkerns and all these places. So what I want to say is that the African average for the informal sector is about 83%. So most of the people in Kenya are employed in the informal sector. They're self-employed.
Yes.
But in South Africa, there are it's about 17%. So if you look I was doing some research recently about Southern Africa, with this. I was shocked that Botswana, which has been doing so well, with GDP growth, they've got a high unemployment rate. Then I looked at the rest of the region, they've also got high unemployment rate. So we are exporting our warped economic structure, which is basically the monopolies in every single industry. You've got a big three, big four, they lock out opportunities for small informal businesses, big agriculture, because many of these people are employed in agriculture in other African countries, like Ethiopia. Most of these countries are agriculture absorbs a lot of people. But in South Africa, you haven't got that avenue because of big agriculture, big retail, and it shuts out small entrepreneurs. That's number one. So there's a structural issue, and I really don't like talking about. I know it's important because it's more important. What are the drivers? What are the levers we can do to address this unemployment crisis? Yeah. So the first thing I want to say is that there was a National Development Plan in 2012. It had a target of 5.4% GDP growth until 2030, and it would create 11 million jobs, by 2030. And so what happened? Why hasn't it succeeded? Nobody was responsible for achieving the target. Now, the two most important institutions in an economy is the Reserve Bank and National Treasury. So National Treasury basically blue-ticked these targets and has never said anything about how we're going to achieve the RDPs, not the NDP's economic targets. And the Reserve Bank, so the Treasury only cares about debt, the Reserve Bank only cares about inflation. So none of these institutions are focused. So nobody is, we watched the speech yesterday, there was not even a number for GDP growth. So all the fast-growing countries in their development plans, I don't even know. So the first thing what we need Ntsiki, is we need a mobilizing vision and plan for this economy with a developmental central bank that will grow the economy, contribute towards growing the economy, financing government spending, contributing towards industrialization as we had in Asia, and we need a national treasury that's going to start spending money into the economy again. So we have to have a non-negotiable 6% GDP growth target, and there are many ways in which we can achieve that. Since the start of the pandemic, I've been one of the people who were involved in the campaign for universal basic income or the basic income grant. And I've done a lot of work on this. People stop me in the malls to ask me how this thing is going to work. And, right now, I think we've largely won this debate, within the ANC, within civil society, within the public, that we must have universal basic income. The only stumbling block is at National Treasury, because the ANC members themselves, the president, I've been to so many events where he says he wants this to happen. He said so yesterday as well. So I think eventually that thing is going to break, and the National Treasury will have to implement a basic income grant. So and I've done, I just have to say that this is the most researched topic, economic policy topic, since 1994. There are so many studies, including a few by myself, where I've been into explaining how we can do this thing. The second issue is we need a job guarantee. Now, the second issue is that we need an industrial policy that is going to change the structure of the economy towards labor-intensive ones that absorb more labor. So remember I said that the relationship between GDP growth and employment is about 0.9. So 1%, and it increases employment by 0.9. There's never been jobless growth. So we have to increase what we call the labor intensity of GDP growth and provide lots of incentives for businesses to shift towards these sectors. So that's the second lever. And currently, the DTI master plans, it's about 700,000 employees out of 16. It's like a drop in the ocean. So we're not really doing much. And then one of the things that you talked about now is Black SME finance. It's a topic of mine. I talk about it a lot. So in 2018, the Banking Association said the total balance sheet exposure of banks towards Black SMEs is about 21 billion total. And I once went to a Banking Association dinner and lunch workshop. I was one of the speakers, and all the big bosses of the banks were there. And I said, you can't be including the West Bank loans, to me and you. But anyway, the point is, that's about 0.3% of 0.3 or 4% of their total assets of more than 6 trillion. So what we're dealing with from the banking sector is, it's not, in every country there's a risk aversion towards SMEs, but we're dealing with racism from the banks. So my solution to that is simple. We've got to have developmental targets, or you can call them quotas, for Black lending to labor-intensive sectors and to Black SMEs. So we need to set a target. Quotas, that's how many happens in many Asian countries and China. You set quotas that they have to achieve, like 10%, And then we've also got a very deep financial markets. We've got, what is called non-bank financial institutions and banks. They've got assets of about 24 trillion rands just sitting there. So I'm saying that we should have development targets for non-bank financial institutions as well of about 10%. I'm speaking at the Old Mutual Conference next weekend in Sun City, and I'll be going into detail as to how we can do that. So that's number 2. Number 3 is public employment programs. Now we've got the presidential employment stimulus that he talked about yesterday. We've also got the expanded public works program, and we've got the community works program. These are the 3 public employment programs. Because if we have GDP growth and we have industrial policy, there'll still be people who are unemployed. If they do everything I say must see, so I'm saying we've got to amalgamate these 3 programs and create one institution that is going to develop the capacity to create more jobs. And it's going to have civil society oversight. It's going to become a public-private, community-led initiative. So what would happen in practice is that, in Soweto, people would give, proposals. There would be professional management that adjudicates these contracts, these projects that can create jobs. And but like the president yesterday said, we are going to exponentially increase the expanded public works program. Then if you look at the budget for that program, it's been slashed by 45%. you know.
Exponentially.
Exponentially, it's been cut exponentially. I like the way you put it. And then the budget for the community works program has been cut by 45% as well. And then the presidential employment stimulus budget has been cut by 2 billion. So if you add those three programs, they create about 1.8 million work opportunities, not full-time jobs. It's like piece jobs. And the quality of the jobs varies. It's slightly better in the presidential employment stimulus than in the EPWP and the community works program. So 9.3 billion to 10 billion rands cuts in these programs. And so what I'm saying is that we need to increase spending on these programs and start getting more public employment programs. Then the fourth thing that we have to provide universal public services. You know, this is your electricity, this is your health care, education. You know, so I also believe these universal public services should supplement universal basic income and the job guarantee. So I believe fees must fall. There must be free education from right until tertiary, and right until postgraduate. There must be free.
We can afford it.
We'll come back to that later. And then number two, we need this national health insurance as well. But obviously with the DA, the government's likely to backtrack. So everything that comes out of this DA government this DA ANC right wing can't work. And then also the people can't afford this electricity.
DA is anti-poor.
Yeah, so we can't afford these electricity prices. So there has to be increased subsidization of these electricity prices. And that's what the IMF does. That's why you're seeing, in Nigeria, they want you to reduce subsidies for poor people to balance your budgets. But we have to have increasingly subsidized electricity. So that's the other one. Then the other one, my number is like regional integration. We can't be an island of prosperity in a sea of poverty in our region. So I went to Eswatini at the age of 11 to study at high school. So the point what I'm saying is that what really upsets me is the xenophobia in our society. Because I was really happy that the xenophobic parties, Mashaba didn't do well, and I was really happy, about the Patriotic Alliance. It's amazing how a xenophobic and a Zionist.
It's actually Afrophobic.
Yeah, Afrophobic, yeah.
Right.
A Zionist, like Patriotic Alliance.
Mm-hmm.
They've become normalized. Someone who says, I would kill more Palestinians, I would bomb them, and someone who says I'll switch off the oxygen of the illegal foreigners in the hospitals, and that person has now been, that person is now normalized. I just don't get it. But what I'm trying to say, but I do think that it's kind of become obvious that the xenophobia is not a good election. They didn't do well on those tickets, So just what I'm saying, if you add them up together, so for me that was one hopeful thing. But what I'm trying to say is that international migration is a function of unbalanced development in the region. So wherever you go to Kenya, it's Somalia. There's a war in Somalia that's been going on for many years. If you go to the US, Donald Trump is talking about Mexico, If you go wherever, it's your neighbors, So in South Africa, it's no different. And people in South Africa must stop being ahistoric, Since the middle of the 19th century, people from Lesotho and Mozambique have been living in South Africa. Ruth First wrote, so the Lesotho people have been here since the middle of the 19th century. Ruth First wrote that by the beginning of the 20th century, 2/3 of the people on the mines were from Mozambique. So throughout the apartheid period, there was a regional labor market. People are forgetting that. There was free movement of labor within the South African Customs Union until their independence. People could, you'd come from Eswatini to South Africa, but you'd still be black. But there was movement of labor. You could get your UIF payments, the payments.
Yeah.
In the mines, there are arrangements where you could get your retrenchment payments in the other countries, So the apartheid government, I don't know what, so Lesotho and Swaziland have always been with us. So now fast forward to 1994. So in 1994, about 57% of people on the mines were from the region. And the same in agriculture, there are many people from the region. So all that has happened over the past 24 years in terms of migration is that the collapse of the Zimbabwean economy. So there's now 2.4 million migrants, 3.9% of the population, and 1 million of them is from Zimbabwe. So our migrants are from Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Lesotho, and Malawi. 78, almost 80%. Now, the last three have been in South Africa since, before 94. All that has happened, when you look at the macro numbers, is the collapse of the Zimbabwean economy. So I say what we need to do is to integrate our region and create a larger market. So what we must do, the South African Customs Union, which includes, our neighbors, Lesotho, Botswana, Namibia, and Botswana, I think we must upgrade it to a common market where we have free movement of labor. And then later on, we must invite Mozambique and Lesotho to join this common market. And there's also a financing arrangement within the customs union that we have to change how it works and convert it into a development fund. And at the same time, we must also, top up that development fund I was speaking to Professor Smamandla Zondi, and he says, Duma, who's going to benefit the most from regional integration? It is South Africa. Who's going to get hurt most? It is South Africa. Because if you look at Africa as a whole, Southern Africa is the slowest growing economy in the whole continent. We are dragging our neighbors down. Do you see what I'm saying? So we have to get the whole region, we have to get the whole region growing very fast. We must sort out that economy in Zimbabwe, and we must, we would have to make transfers to that economy. In the same way, we must make transfers to our local economy. We must make transfers to get that economy going. And I always tell people that, I've been to Zimbabwe more times than I've been to Cape Town, and I'm proud of that, So we have to get our region going, yes, as well, yeah.
So before I let you go, I want us to touch on the banking issue, because you did speak about it. Like a lot of the times we hear conversations about nationalizing the banks. Who actually owns the banking system? Can we unpack?
Yeah, before we go to the banks, quickly, sorry about that. The one thing I forgot to mention is I talked about bank lending to SMEs, which we need quotas for.
Yeah.
But the government lending to SMEs is shocking. The National Empowerment Fund hasn't got funding from the government, except COVID funds recently since inception. And the Small Enterprise Finance Agency, you're giving 2.4 billion for CFA and 0.6 billion from National Empowerment Fund. And so there's 3 billion rands for every black person in South Africa. No, that's not right. So we have to recapitalize these development finance agencies, and they must be able to, create more jobs. Now, in terms of, I like to talk about the banks and the mines, So in a previous life, I used to do a lot of work on the mines. So I recently did a new study in terms of ownership of the mines. The president, in his State of the Nation address, he said 38% of the mines are owned by, 39% of the mines are owned by black people. Now, then I ask people, just use common sense, Who, it's Patrice and who? Yeah, let's just use your common sense. We own 39% of our, so the Black Business Council asked me to do a study, which they haven't published yet. But anyway, according to my calculations, about 8% that we own in terms of black people in the mines, And that's number one. Number two, we've got something, the president talked about sovereign wealth fund yesterday in the speech, but I was the one who introduced this concept of a sovereign wealth fund into the public discourse many years ago. But what he was talking about is not a sovereign wealth fund. But anyway, so the PIC ownership of the mines is about 30%, So I said 30% of the value of South African assets. So I'm saying that let's restructure this mining. Remember there was debate around nationalization. And so I came up with concrete proposals as what we should do. So we should, the 30%, PIC ownership should be put in a sovereign wealth fund, and then it should be topped up with royalties every year, like about 40% of the royalties that these companies pay, and then they should increase ownership of the mines, the state on behalf of South African people.
Yes.
And then the second part is the BEE. So that should be we should, basically the government has stopped BEE in the mining industry without going into details, but we should restart BEE in the mining industry, and 25% ownership by workers, communities, and also BEE shareholders here. And I do believe that there should be free shares, portion of free shares given to the workers and the communities. So if we can easily achieve 51% ownership of the mines by the state and black companies within a few years, if there was the political will. And I remember once going to Anglo and presenting this to them and explaining to us how it would work, and I went into detail of that. That's number one. Number two, the banks, state control and influence over the banking sector was the most important, explanation of the growth of East Asia. The developmental states in East Asia. I've just finished rereading 2 books on Korea. The first thing they did, they nationalized every bank in the early 60s, And so all those countries, they took control of their banking sector. So I'm saying we need to do something similar. So now in China, they've got a model. They've got state ownership. So what the state ownership of the banks does, it gives an additional tool of macroeconomic policy. Let me just give you an example. After the global financial crisis, the Chinese had a stimulus of about, how much was it? It was about $600 billion, which they used to stimulate the economy after the first one in 2009. But the banks, state-owned banks, their stimulus was even more. They were instructed by the government to lend. I think it was about 1.4 trillion that the state-owned banks. So it provides another tool of macroeconomic policy. So I believe that we have to start somewhere. We have to also, they have a company called Central Hujuin, which owns the shares in the banks. So we should, in the same way we have a sovereign wealth fund for the mines, we should also have a holding company for the banks, because the PIC as well owns a lot of shares in the banks. To what objective, So I'm saying that we need, so we've got like roughly 5 banks and 2 insurers, and they must consolidate their assets around those, and then maybe start with 1 bank and 1 insurer, because you have to get control. We've got this huge financial sector of 44 trillion rands in bank and non-financial. So we have to have a seat at the table. So we must start owning shares, like they can easily increase shares in there. Then there's the BE, and then there's also, so I'm just saying that we have to increase the state and black ownership of these banks as well. And we obviously have to have a state bank. African Bank should be the state bank, and then it might merge with Postbank, and we should bring together. We need to have
When they say that we've got black banks, when you follow the money and follow the trail, you always find that they're attached to the white institution. So in South Africa, do we actually have any black-owned banks?
No, we don't have a black-owned bank here. No, we don't. Yeah. So I'm just saying. So we have to start. It's such a big sector that you have to have state involvement as well. So the bank lending is not productive. They give like home loans, which is mostly used to finance existing homes. So it's circulate, car loans, but they're not geared towards productive investment in the economy. And so these Asian countries, they took control of the banks. And so I'm saying, as an interim measure, we should increase state ownership of these banks and black ownership of the banks. And then we also need to have like developmental targets for the banks and the non-bank financial institutions like insurance companies. And I would say, like, for example, if you did it for the non-bank financial institutions, you could, at 10%, you could raise like 1 trillion rands from that as well. Yeah.
So it sounds like Abelungu own our banks and our mines, and that's.
And then I must just go back to, I used to work my initial thing was Black economic empowerment. Tammy was actually one who made me become. I was like coconut tendencies. I came back from the UK. You're telling me about your private school experience. I was like, I came back to South Africa, and the only person I knew in Joburg was my sister, who was a bit famous, and then old Tammy as well. Tammy Mazwai, and he used to introduce me to all these BEs, and I used to follow him everywhere. But the point is, so you were asking about Black ownership, yeah. So there's a lot of fake statistics when Ntsiki on this Black ownership. In the 30-year review, the government says it's 38%, and then the JSE is 20 trillion or something like that. Now do your sense check. Do 38% times 20 trillion, you get to 8.5 trillion. So Black people own. This is the Black Economic Empowerment Commission. They say we own 39%. So there's a voodoo system of accounting for Black ownership, and I've got my statistics. Black ownership is about 1.2% of the JSE, and then if you strip out the non-South African assets, it goes to about, I can't remember, about 6%. Yeah. So we must not be ashamed of talking about this white-owned economy. I don't know why this word white monopoly capital it is what it is.
Yeah.
So we should call it what it is. So it's, like when you deny that there's white monopoly capital, it's like you're denying, I don't know.
Oxygen.
Yeah. So I just don't get it. So we must not be ashamed to say that it's a white-controlled economy. It's a fact. And they can bring all their manga stats and their voodoo stats. The stats are meant to, deflect us from the fact. They say, oh, no, Black people have pension funds, but that's not what accounting. Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
But Duma, thank you. This
so
is
much.
not the last time you're coming to educate us. That was so fruitful. And thank you 100 times.
I'm so tired now.
I know, we did a lot of work.
Yeah.
Moya with light, Moya with bright. Thank you so much for joining us, guys. There it is.
Who are you when all you were has been diluted by lies and white lines cancelling out all that which has been written of your history? Why do you look at yourself as a mystery? Doesn't the sun shine because you open your eyes? Doesn't the moon stay situated within the same stars your DNA sparkles off? Your spirit knows that surely corner into it off. Buza umoya so you may return to being well off. Because spiritually you are rich, yet your ancestors cry because you are out of reach. But yours is to command all elements while God takes inspiration from the very mirror she looked at to become. Remember who you are and never finish just when they think that with you they are done.